Question 1. Market research demonstrates that clients often seek guidance on how their deceased spouses will impact their rights to jointly owned assets. In Alabama, following the death of a surviving spouse discovers that the deceased will purports to distribute the entirety of their jointly acquired property, which is considered community property under Alabama law, to beneficiaries other than the surviving spouse. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surviving spouse to protect their interests? Option A. The surviving spouse must abide by the terms of the will, as it represents the deceased spouse's final wishes regarding the disposition of their assets. Option B. The surviving spouse should consult with an attorney to understand their statutory right to an elective share of the community property, which may allow them to claim their legal portion of the assets regardless of the will's provisions. Option C. The surviving spouse should immediately relinquish all claims to the community property to avoid potential legal disputes and honor the deceased's intentions. Option D. The surviving spouse should accept any provisions made for them in the will, as this is the only recourse available to them concerning the estate. The correct answer is B. The surviving spouse should consult with an attorney to understand their statutory right to an elective share of the community property, which may allow them to claim their legal portion of the assets regardless of the will's provisions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the interplay between a surviving spouse's statutory rights and the specific provisions of a deceased spouse's will concerning community property in Alabama. Navigating this requires a thorough understanding of Alabama's community property principles, which differ significantly from common law property states, and how these principles interact with testamentary dispositions. Careful judgment is required to ensure the surviving spouse's rights are respected while also adhering to the deceased's wishes as expressed in the will, within the bounds of Alabama law. The best professional approach involves advising the surviving spouse that under Alabama law, a surviving spouse has a right to an elective share of the deceased spouse's estate, which includes their share of community property. This right is designed to protect surviving spouses from being disinherited. Therefore, the surviving spouse can elect to take their statutory share of the community property, even if the will attempts to devise it differently. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with Alabama Code sections governing spousal elective shares and the nature of community property. It prioritizes the statutory protections afforded to surviving spouses, ensuring their legal rights are upheld. An incorrect approach would be to advise the surviving spouse that the will's provisions are absolute and must be followed without exception. This fails to acknowledge the statutory right of election available to surviving spouses in Alabama, which supersedes the will's disposition of the surviving spouse's share of community property. This approach violates Alabama law by disregarding the spouse's fundamental legal protections. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest that the surviving spouse must accept whatever the will offers, regardless of its fairness or legality, because it was the deceased's final wish. While respecting the deceased's wishes is important, it cannot come at the expense of legally mandated spousal rights. This approach ignores the legal framework that balances testamentary freedom with spousal protection. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the surviving spouse to immediately relinquish all claims to the community property in favor of the beneficiaries named in the will, without fully understanding the implications or their legal rights. This is professionally negligent, as it bypasses the necessary legal advice and due diligence required to protect the spouse's interests under Alabama law. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive review of the relevant state's property laws, specifically focusing on community property and spousal elective share statutes. This should be followed by a careful examination of the deceased's will and any other relevant estate planning documents. The professional must then clearly explain the client's legal rights and options, including the potential benefits and drawbacks of each course of action, grounded in the specific legal framework of the jurisdiction. Question 2. Market research demonstrates that clients often seek clarity on property classification during marital dissolution in Alabama. A married couple in Alabama purchased a condominium during their marriage. One spouse provided a substantial down payment for the condominium, which was derived from an inheritance received prior to the marriage. The remaining balance was financed through a mortgage obtained during the marriage. What is the most appropriate approach to determine the classification of the condominium and the down payment? Option A. Assume that any commingling of the inherited funds with marital funds for the down payment irrevocably converts the entire asset into community property. Option B. Rely solely on the testimony of the spouse who received the inheritance to establish the separate nature of the down payment, without requiring supporting financial documentation. Option C. Meticulously trace the source of the down payment to determine if it originated from the spouse's separate inheritance, and if so, consider that portion as separate property, while the remainder acquired through marital effort or funds is presumed community property. Option D. Automatically classify the entire condominium as community property because it was purchased during the marriage, regardless of the source of the down payment. Correct answer is C. Meticulously trace the source of the down payment to determine if it originated from the spouse's separate inheritance, and if so, consider that portion as separate property while the remainder acquired through marital effort or funds is presumed community property. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's community property presumptions, particularly when dealing with assets acquired during a marriage that may have been funded by separate property. The presumption of community property is a cornerstone of Alabama law, but it is rebuttable. Misinterpreting or misapplying this presumption can lead to significant financial and legal consequences for the parties involved, potentially resulting in the improper classification of assets and disputes over ownership. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between assets that are truly community property and those that may retain their separate character despite commingling or acquisition during the marriage. The best professional approach involves meticulously tracing the source of funds used to acquire the asset in question. This requires a thorough review of financial records, including bank statements, investment account statements, and any documentation that can demonstrate the origin of the funds. If the evidence clearly shows that the down payment for the condominium originated from a spouse's inheritance, which is considered separate property in Alabama, then the presumption that the condominium is community property can be rebutted. This approach aligns with Alabama Code Section 30-4-3, which outlines the division of property in divorce, and implicitly relies on the correct classification of property as either separate or community. By focusing on the origin of funds, a professional upholds the principle that separate property remains separate unless clearly transmuted into community property through intent or action. An incorrect approach would be to automatically classify the condominium as community property simply because it was acquired during the marriage. This fails to acknowledge the rebuttable nature of the community property presumption and ignores the potential for separate property to be used in its acquisition. Such an approach violates the professional duty to accurately assess and advise on property rights based on established legal principles. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any commingling of separate funds with marital funds automatically converts the entire asset into community property without further analysis. While commingling can complicate matters, Alabama law allows for tracing and recovery of separate property interests if they can be clearly identified. Failing to attempt this tracing, and instead defaulting to a full community property classification, is a misapplication of the law. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the testimony of one spouse regarding the source of funds without seeking corroborating documentary evidence. While testimony is a factor, the presumption of community property is strong, and overcoming it typically requires objective proof. Ignoring the need for such proof and making a determination based on uncorroborated statements is professionally unsound. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the asset and the relevant presumption, in this case, the presumption of community property in Alabama. Second, gather all available financial documentation related to the acquisition and any subsequent contributions to the asset. Third, meticulously trace the source of all funds involved, distinguishing between separate and community property contributions. Fourth, apply Alabama's specific statutory and case law regarding the rebuttability of community property presumptions and the treatment of commingled funds. Finally, provide advice and recommendations based on a thorough analysis of the evidence and the applicable legal framework, ensuring that the client's rights to separate property are protected. Question 3. Compliance review shows that an executor is administering the estate of a deceased spouse in Alabama. The deceased incurred significant personal debts prior to the marriage. The surviving spouse is concerned about how these premarital debts will affect the distribution of community property. What is the most appropriate course of action for the executor to take regarding these premarital debts in relation to the community property? Option A. Charge all premarital debts directly against the surviving spouse's share of the community property, as the debts were incurred before the marriage. Option B. Disregard the premarital debts entirely, as they are personal to the deceased and have no bearing on the administration or distribution of community property in Alabama. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of each premarital debt to determine if it conferred a benefit upon the marital community or was satisfied with community funds, and consult Alabama law to ascertain the proper allocation of liability between the deceased's separate estate and the community property. Option D. Automatically assume all premarital debts are solely the responsibility of the deceased's separate estate and should not impact the community property in any way, regardless of how marital assets were managed. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed review of each premarital debt to determine if it conferred a benefit upon the marital community or was satisfied with community funds, and consult Alabama law to ascertain the proper allocation of liability between the deceased's separate estate and the community property. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the complexities of Alabama's community property laws concerning premarital debts and their impact on marital assets. The executor must balance the deceased's estate obligations with the surviving spouse's rights and liabilities under Alabama law, requiring a precise understanding of how debts incurred before marriage are treated when community property is involved. Careful judgment is required to ensure all legal obligations are met without improperly encumbering the surviving spouse's separate property or community property. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all premarital debts and the nature of the property acquired during the marriage. Under Alabama law, premarital debts are generally the separate obligation of the spouse who incurred them. However, if community property has been commingled or used to satisfy these debts, or if the debt directly benefited the community, the situation becomes more complex. The executor must identify which debts are solely the deceased's responsibility and which might have implications for the community estate. This approach prioritizes adherence to Alabama's specific statutes governing separate and community property and debt allocation, ensuring that the estate is administered according to law and that the surviving spouse's rights are protected. This involves distinguishing between separate debts and those that may have become liabilities of the community estate, potentially requiring the use of community assets for satisfaction only if legally permissible and properly documented. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume all premarital debts are automatically the sole responsibility of the deceased's estate, regardless of how marital assets were used or benefited. This fails to account for potential commingling or situations where the debt's benefit extended to the marital community, which could create a claim against community property under Alabama law. Another incorrect approach is to automatically charge all premarital debts against the surviving spouse's share of the community property without proper legal determination. This violates the principle that premarital debts are primarily separate obligations and could lead to the surviving spouse bearing an undue burden. A third incorrect approach is to ignore premarital debts altogether, assuming they are irrelevant to the distribution of community property. This is a significant legal oversight that could result in creditors pursuing claims against the estate or community property improperly, leading to legal disputes and financial liabilities for the estate and the surviving spouse. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach when dealing with debts in a community property context. This involves 1. Identifying all debts and classifying them as premarital or marital. 2. Analyzing the nature of premarital debts and whether they conferred any benefit upon the marital community or were satisfied with community funds. 3. Consulting Alabama statutes and case law specifically addressing the liability of separate and community property for premarital debts. 4. Seeking legal counsel when the classification or allocation of debts is unclear or contentious. 5. Ensuring transparent communication with the surviving spouse regarding the status of debts and their impact on the estate distribution. Question 4. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in client inquiries regarding the division of assets upon marital dissolution. A married couple in Alabama, who have been married for 15 years, approaches you for advice. The wife brought a significant parcel of undeveloped land into the marriage as her separate property. Over the years, the husband has contributed financially to its upkeep and has made substantial improvements to the property, including building a guest house. Both spouses have verbally expressed their desire for this land to be considered their property and to be treated as community property for estate planning purposes. They are now seeking your guidance on how to legally effectuate this change in property characterization under Alabama law. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Recommend that they simply continue to treat the property as jointly owned, as this informal approach will be recognized by Alabama courts in the event of divorce or death. Option B. Inform the couple that due to the husband's financial contributions and the improvements made to the land, it has automatically become community property under Alabama law. Option C. Suggest that the verbal expressions of desire for the land to be their property are sufficient to establish it as community property, and no further action is required. Option D. Advise the couple that the most legally sound method to transmute the wife's separate property into community property is through a written agreement, clearly stating their intent to transmute the land and specifying the date of transmutation, which should then be properly recorded. Correct answer is D. Advise the couple that the most legally sound method to transmute the wife's separate property into community property is through a written agreement, clearly stating their intent to transmute the land and specifying the date of transmutation, which should then be properly recorded. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of Alabama's community property laws, particularly concerning the transmutation of separate property into community property and the potential for unintended consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any actions taken are legally sound and align with the client's informed consent and intentions. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding of Alabama's specific community property statutes and case law regarding transmutation. This includes recognizing that transmutation requires clear intent to change the character of property, often evidenced by a written agreement. A professional should advise the clients on the legal implications of their proposed actions, ensuring they understand that their separate property could become subject to community property division upon divorce or death. The professional should then facilitate the creation of a legally binding document that clearly articulates the intent to transmute the property, specifying the exact assets involved and the date of the change. This approach prioritizes legal compliance, client education, and the establishment of clear, documented intent, thereby protecting both the clients and the professional from future disputes or legal challenges. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the oral agreement without any written documentation. Alabama law generally requires clear and convincing evidence of intent to transmute separate property to community property, and oral agreements are often insufficient to meet this standard, especially when challenged. This failure to document intent creates significant legal ambiguity and exposes the clients to the risk of the property retaining its separate character or being deemed community property without their fully informed consent to the specific legal mechanism of transmutation. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that simply pooling assets or making joint improvements automatically transmutes separate property into community property without explicit intent. While such actions might be considered as evidence of intent in some contexts, they are not conclusive under Alabama law and can lead to disputes about the extent and nature of the transmutation. Relying on such assumptions without clear, documented intent is legally precarious. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise the clients that their separate property will automatically become community property simply by virtue of their marriage. Alabama is a community property state, but the character of property is determined by how it is acquired and the intent of the parties, not solely by the marital status. Failing to explain the specific legal requirements for transmutation and the need for explicit intent and documentation is a significant professional failing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant Alabama community property laws. This involves identifying the specific legal requirements for the action contemplated in this case, transmutation. The next step is to thoroughly educate the clients about these requirements and the potential consequences of their decisions. Crucially, all agreements and intentions must be documented in writing, in accordance with legal standards, to provide clear evidence and prevent future disputes. This systematic approach ensures that advice is legally sound, ethically responsible, and fully aligned with client objectives. Question 5. The audit findings indicate that a spouse in Alabama, without consulting their partner, recently sold a significant piece of jointly owned real estate that was acquired during their marriage. What is the most appropriate course of action for a legal advisor to recommend to the spouse who was not involved in the sale? Option A. Advise the uninvolved spouse that the transaction is a private matter between the spouses and that legal intervention is generally not warranted in such situations. Option B. Advise the uninvolved spouse on their legal rights and potential remedies under Alabama law to address the disposition of the jointly owned property, which may include seeking to invalidate the sale or pursue damages. Option C. Recommend that the uninvolved spouse immediately initiate legal proceedings to dissolve the marriage, as this action indicates a fundamental breakdown in marital trust. Option D. Inform the uninvolved spouse that Alabama law grants each spouse absolute control over property acquired during the marriage, and therefore, the sale is legally unassailable. The correct answer is B. Advise the uninvolved spouse on their legal rights and potential remedies under Alabama law to address the disposition of the jointly owned property, which may include seeking to invalidate the sale or pursue damages. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential mishandling of community property assets in Alabama, presenting a professionally challenging situation due to the fiduciary duties owed by spouses to each other concerning community property. Alabama law, while not a pure community property state, recognizes certain forms of co-ownership and management rights that require careful adherence to statutory provisions and common law principles to avoid disputes and ensure equitable treatment. The challenge lies in navigating the specific rights and responsibilities associated with managing and controlling these assets, particularly when one spouse acts unilaterally in a manner that could prejudice the other's interests. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's legal framework governing marital property. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of Alabama law pertaining to the management and control of property acquired during marriage, specifically focusing on the rights and obligations of each spouse. This includes understanding the presumption of equal management and control over community property, unless specifically altered by agreement or statute. When faced with a situation where one spouse has made a significant disposition of community property without the other's consent or knowledge, the correct course of action is to advise the aggrieved spouse on their legal rights and remedies under Alabama law, which may include seeking to void the transaction or seeking damages. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the potential violation of the non-acting spouse's rights and seeks to rectify the situation within the established legal framework of Alabama. It upholds the principle of mutual consent and protection of marital assets as intended by the law. An incorrect approach would be to advise the spouse who made the disposition that they have absolute discretion over all community property assets, regardless of the other spouse's involvement or consent. This fails to acknowledge the shared ownership and management rights inherent in community property principles as recognized in Alabama, potentially leading to legal challenges and breaches of fiduciary duty. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the concern entirely, suggesting that such transactions are a private matter between spouses without regard to legal implications. This ignores the statutory protections afforded to marital property and the potential for one spouse to act in bad faith, thereby harming the other's equitable interest. Finally, advising the aggrieved spouse to pursue legal action without first understanding the specific nature of the property and the applicable Alabama statutes would be premature and potentially ineffective. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific facts of the situation, identifying the relevant legal framework, in this case, Alabama law concerning marital property, and then advising clients on their rights and obligations within that framework. This involves a diligent inquiry into the nature of the property, how it was acquired, and the actions taken by each spouse. The goal is to provide guidance that is legally sound, ethically responsible, and protective of the client's interests while adhering to the principles of fairness and equity. Question 6. The evaluation methodology shows that in Alabama, a client is seeking advice regarding a valuable piece of real estate purchased solely by one spouse 5 years before their marriage. The client states that they have always considered this property to be exclusively theirs and have managed it independently, even making significant improvements using their personal savings accumulated before the marriage. What is the most appropriate course of action to determine the property's classification under Alabama community property law? Option A. Advise the client that based on the purchase date before the marriage and the use of premarital savings for improvements, the property is definitively their separate property, but recommend gathering all documentation to support this claim for future reference. Option B. Inform the client that any property acquired before marriage is automatically considered separate property in Alabama, and no further investigation is necessary. Option C. Recommend that the property be treated as community property due to its acquisition by one spouse before the marriage, as this is a common outcome in divorce proceedings. Option D. Suggest that because the property was acquired by one spouse before the marriage, it is their separate property, and any improvements made during the marriage are irrelevant to its classification. The correct answer is A. Advise the client that based on the purchase date before the marriage and the use of premarital savings for improvements, the property is definitively their separate property, but recommend gathering all documentation to support this claim for future reference. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the classification of property acquired before marriage is fundamental to accurately advising clients in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise application of Alabama's community property principles to a situation where the character of the asset, separate or community, is not immediately obvious and could have significant financial implications for the parties involved, especially in the context of divorce or estate planning. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between separate property, which remains solely with the acquiring spouse, and community property, which is owned equally by both spouses. The best professional approach involves meticulously tracing the source of funds used to acquire the property and any subsequent improvements or commingling. This means gathering all relevant documentation, such as prenuptial agreements, deeds, bank statements, and evidence of separate contributions, to definitively establish whether the property was owned by one spouse before the marriage or acquired with separate funds during the marriage. Alabama law presumes property acquired during the marriage is community property, but this presumption can be rebutted by clear and convincing evidence that the property was acquired with separate funds or was a gift or inheritance to one spouse. Adhering to this documentation-heavy, evidence-based approach ensures compliance with Alabama Code Title 30, Chapter 4, which governs marital property and divorce, and upholds the ethical duty to provide accurate and well-supported legal advice. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the property was acquired by one spouse before the marriage, it automatically remains their separate property without further inquiry. This fails to account for potential commingling of funds or improvements made with community assets during the marriage, which could alter the property's character or create a community interest. This approach violates the principle of thorough due diligence and could lead to misrepresentation of a client's rights. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the title holder's assertion that the property is separate without seeking corroborating evidence. Alabama law requires more than mere assertion. It demands proof. This oversight neglects the statutory framework that defines community property and the burden of proof required to overcome the presumption of community ownership for assets acquired during the marriage. A further incorrect approach is to advise the client that any property acquired by either spouse prior to the marriage is unequivocally separate property, regardless of how it was managed or improved during the marriage. This oversimplifies the complex interplay between separate and community property in Alabama and ignores potential legal arguments for community interest arising from the use of community funds or efforts for the benefit of the separate property. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive understanding of Alabama's community property statutes and case law. Professionals must then engage in diligent fact-finding, meticulously collecting and analyzing all relevant documentation. This evidence-based approach, coupled with a clear understanding of the legal presumptions and burdens of proof, allows for accurate classification of property and informed advice that aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal a situation where a couple in Alabama separated on January 15, 2023, and subsequently, the husband purchased a vehicle on March 10, 2023, using funds from an inheritance he received prior to the marriage. What is the most appropriate classification of this vehicle under Alabama community property law? Option A. The vehicle is community property because it was acquired after the date of separation, but before the final divorce decree. Option B. The vehicle is community property because the divorce was not yet finalized when it was purchased. Option C. The vehicle is the husband's separate property because it was acquired after the date of separation using funds from a premarital inheritance. Option D. The vehicle is the husband's separate property because he was the one who physically purchased it. The correct answer is C. The vehicle is the husband's separate property because it was acquired after the date of separation using funds from a premarital inheritance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's community property laws as they apply to assets acquired after a marital separation, but before a final divorce decree. The distinction between separate and community property can become blurred during this period, and mischaracterizing an asset can lead to significant financial and legal repercussions for one or both spouses. Careful judgment is required to accurately classify property based on the timing of acquisition and the intent of the parties. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously examining the source of funds and the intent of the parties regarding property acquired after the date of separation. In Alabama, property acquired after separation is generally considered separate property of the spouse who acquired it, provided it was not acquired with community funds or through the exertion of community effort. This approach aligns with the principle that the marital community effectively dissolves upon separation, and subsequent acquisitions should not automatically be subject to division. This is supported by Alabama case law that often presumes property acquired after separation is separate unless proven otherwise. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to automatically classify all property acquired after separation as community property. This fails to recognize that the marital community's termination upon separation alters the presumption of community ownership. This approach ignores the specific legal framework in Alabama that allows for separate property acquisition post-separation. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any asset purchased by one spouse after separation, regardless of the source of funds, is automatically their separate property. This overlooks the possibility that community funds or the efforts of the other spouse may have contributed to the acquisition, thereby making it community property. Alabama law requires a thorough investigation into the origin of the funds used for acquisition. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on the date of the divorce decree to determine the character of property. While the decree finalizes the division, the classification of property is often determined by events and circumstances occurring prior to the decree, particularly the date of separation. This approach neglects the critical period between separation and finalization. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach that begins with identifying the date of legal separation. They must then trace the source of funds for any asset acquired after that date. If the funds are demonstrably separate, e.g., inheritance, premarital savings not commingled, or if the asset was acquired through the sole efforts of one spouse without utilizing community resources, it is likely separate property. Conversely, if community funds or efforts were involved, it may be classified as community property subject to division. Documentation and clear communication with clients regarding these principles are paramount. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clarity on spousal rights in managing marital assets within Alabama. A married couple in Alabama, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, jointly purchased a piece of undeveloped land during their marriage using funds primarily earned by Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith wishes to sell this land to a developer without informing Mrs. Smith, believing that as the primary earner for the funds used, he has sole authority to manage and dispose of this asset. What is the most appropriate course of action for Mr. Smith to ensure compliance with Alabama law regarding the management of property acquired during marriage? Option A. Sell the land and inform Mrs. Smith of the transaction after it is completed. Option B. Proceed with the sale as Mr. Smith was the primary earner of the funds used for the purchase. Option C. Obtain Mrs. Smith's explicit written consent before proceeding with the sale of the land. Option D. Consult a general business attorney to draft the sales contract, assuming this covers all necessary legal aspects. The correct answer is C. Obtain Mrs. Smith's explicit written consent before proceeding with the sale of the land. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between a spouse's desire to manage community property and the legal framework governing such management in Alabama. Alabama, while not a full community property state, has specific laws regarding the management and disposition of property acquired during marriage that can be analogized to community property principles in other states. The challenge lies in understanding the extent of each spouse's rights and limitations when dealing with assets acquired during the marriage, particularly when one spouse wishes to undertake a significant transaction without the other's explicit consent. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law and to avoid potential legal disputes or financial repercussions for the marital estate. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding and adhering to the specific provisions of Alabama law concerning the management of marital property. This means recognizing that while spouses generally have the right to manage their own separate property, the management of property acquired during the marriage, which may be subject to equitable distribution upon divorce, requires careful consideration of both spouses' interests. In Alabama, while there isn't a strict community property system, laws regarding gifts and conveyances of property acquired during marriage often require the consent of both spouses, especially for real property. Therefore, the approach that prioritizes obtaining the consent of the other spouse for significant transactions involving property acquired during the marriage is the most legally sound and ethically responsible. This aligns with the principle of protecting the marital estate and ensuring that both parties have a voice in decisions that could impact their shared assets. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume unilateral control over any asset acquired during the marriage, regardless of its source or the nature of the transaction. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama law may impose limitations on such unilateral actions, particularly concerning real property or substantial gifts, to protect the interests of the non-managing spouse. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with a significant transaction without any consultation or notification to the other spouse, relying solely on the belief that the asset is jointly acquired. This bypasses the legal requirement for consent in certain situations and can lead to disputes and legal challenges. Finally, an approach that involves seeking advice only from a general legal practitioner without specific expertise in Alabama marital property law could lead to incomplete or inaccurate guidance, potentially resulting in non-compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with marital property in Alabama should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific Alabama statutes governing property acquired during marriage. This includes identifying what constitutes marital property and what rights each spouse has in its management and disposition. When a spouse proposes a significant transaction, the professional should advise them to consult with their spouse, and if necessary, seek legal counsel specializing in Alabama family law to ensure all legal requirements, including spousal consent where applicable, are met. This proactive approach minimizes risk and upholds ethical obligations to both individuals and the integrity of the marital estate. Question 9. Regulatory review indicates that in Alabama, when a spouse inherits property prior to the dissolution of their marriage, what is the primary legal standard to determine if that inherited property has been transmuted into community property subject to division? Option A. The property is considered community property if it was occupied and used by both spouses during the marriage. Option B. The property automatically becomes community property if marital funds are used for any improvements, regardless of the owner-spouse's intent. Option C. Any commingling of inherited funds with marital funds is sufficient to establish the property as community property. Option D. The spouse claiming transmutation must demonstrate, by clear and convincing evidence, a clear and unequivocal intent by the owner-spouse to convert their separate inherited property into community property. The correct answer is D. The spouse claiming transmutation must demonstrate, by clear and convincing evidence, a clear and unequivocal intent by the owner-spouse to convert their separate inherited property into community property. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's community property principles as they apply to the transmutation of separate property into marital property. The core difficulty lies in discerning whether the intent and actions of the spouses effectively converted the inherited property into community property, thereby impacting its distribution upon divorce. Careful judgment is required to apply the legal presumptions and evidentiary standards correctly. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously examining the evidence to determine if the spouse who inherited the property clearly and unequivocally intended to transmute it into community property. This requires looking for affirmative acts or clear declarations of intent, such as jointly titling the property, using marital funds for significant improvements with the intent to benefit the marital estate, or explicit written agreements. Alabama law presumes that property acquired by gift, devise, or descent remains the separate property of the recipient spouse. To overcome this presumption, the intent to transmute must be proven by clear and convincing evidence. This approach aligns with Alabama Code Section 30-4-8, which governs the division of property in divorce and recognizes separate property. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to automatically classify the inherited property as community property simply because it was improved with marital funds. While the use of marital funds can be a factor, it is not, in itself, sufficient to overcome the presumption of separate property in Alabama. Without clear and convincing evidence of intent to transmute, the source of the funds alone does not change the character of the property. This fails to adhere to the evidentiary burden required by Alabama law. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any commingling of separate and marital funds automatically transmutes the separate property into community property. While commingling can be evidence of intent, it is not conclusive. Alabama courts will look at the totality of the circumstances and the clarity of intent. Simply mixing funds without a clear intent to abandon separate property rights is insufficient to effect a transmutation. This approach ignores the critical element of intent required by Alabama's transmutation doctrine. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that the property was used by both spouses during the marriage. The use of inherited property by both spouses does not, by itself, demonstrate an intent to convert it into community property. The legal character of the property is determined by how it was acquired and the intent of the parties regarding its ownership status, not merely its use. This approach misinterprets the legal definition of community property and the requirements for transmutation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such cases by first identifying the character of the property at its acquisition. For inherited property, the initial presumption is that it is separate property. The burden then shifts to the party claiming transmutation to prove, by clear and convincing evidence, that the owner-spouse intended to convert their separate property into community property. This involves a thorough review of all relevant documentation, financial records, and testimony to ascertain the intent behind any actions taken with respect to the property. Professionals must educate their clients on these principles and the evidentiary standards required to succeed in proving or disproving transmutation. Question 10. Performance analysis shows that during their marriage in Alabama, John and Mary purchased a home for $300,000. John contributed $50,000 from his premarital savings as a down payment. The remaining $250,000 was financed by a mortgage. Over the course of their 10-year marriage, they jointly paid down $100,000 of the mortgage principal from their joint bank account, which was funded by their respective salaries earned during the marriage. If the home is now valued at $400,000 and John wishes to claim his premarital contribution as separate property, what is the calculated separate property interest of John in the home, assuming the mortgage principal paid down during the marriage is considered community property? Option A. John's separate property interest is $125,000. Option B. John's separate property interest is $100,000. Option C. John's separate property interest is $62,500. Option D. John's separate property interest is $50,000. The correct answer is C. John's separate property interest is $62,500. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Alabama community property law, accurately classifying and valuing assets acquired during marriage. The complexity arises from the commingling of separate and community funds, requiring meticulous tracing and adherence to specific Alabama statutes governing marital property. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure fair and legally compliant division, avoiding potential disputes and litigation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a detailed tracing of funds to determine the character of the asset. This means meticulously examining bank statements, investment records, and any other financial documentation to identify the source of funds used for the down payment and subsequent mortgage payments. Alabama law presumes property acquired during marriage is community property, but this presumption can be rebutted by clear and convincing evidence that separate funds were used. The calculation would involve determining the proportion of separate funds contributed to the down payment and mortgage payments relative to the total acquisition cost and mortgage principal paid during the marriage. For example, if the separate funds contributed to the down payment represent a specific percentage of the total down payment, and separate funds were also used for a portion of the mortgage payments, the calculation would aim to segregate the separate property interest in the home. This aligns with Alabama Code Section 30-4-8, which allows for the division of marital property, and the principle that separate property remains separate if clearly identifiable. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply divide the equity of the home equally between the spouses, without considering the source of the funds used for acquisition and mortgage payments. This fails to acknowledge the potential separate property interest of the husband in the home, as Alabama law allows for the preservation of separate property. This approach violates the principle of equitable distribution by potentially awarding a portion of the husband's separate property to the wife. Another incorrect approach would be to classify the entire home as community property solely because it was acquired during the marriage, without investigating the source of the down payment. This ignores the possibility that the husband's separate funds were used, which would rebut the presumption of community property for that portion of the investment. This approach is a direct contravention of the evidentiary standards required to overcome the presumption of community property in Alabama. A further incorrect approach would be to assign a fixed percentage of the home's equity to the husband based on a rough estimation of his contributions, without rigorous financial tracing. This lacks the precision and evidentiary support required by Alabama law for property division, particularly when separate property is involved. It risks an inequitable division and potential legal challenges. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach that prioritizes accurate financial tracing and adherence to Alabama's specific community property statutes. This involves 1. Identifying all assets and liabilities. 2. Gathering comprehensive financial documentation related to each asset. 3. Applying Alabama's presumption of community property and understanding the burden of proof to rebut it. 4. Performing detailed calculations to segregate separate and community interests, especially in commingled assets like real estate. 5. Consulting relevant Alabama Code sections and case law to ensure compliance. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that Sarah and John, residents of Alabama, purchased a home during their marriage. Sarah used a significant inheritance she received prior to the marriage as the down payment for this home. The mortgage payments have been made from their joint checking account, which contains both marital earnings and some residual separate funds from Sarah's inheritance that were deposited into it. What is the most appropriate determination regarding the characterization of this home under Alabama community property law? Option A. The home is community property because both spouses are on the mortgage, indicating a joint acquisition and marital intent. Option B. The home is community property because the couple resided in it during their marriage, signifying its use as a marital asset. Option C. The home is presumed to be community property because it was acquired during the marriage and mortgage payments were made from a joint account, regardless of the source of the down payment. Option D. The home is likely Sarah's separate property to the extent of her separate inheritance used for the down payment, provided she can demonstrate the inheritance funds were kept separate and identifiable, and the remaining marital contributions to mortgage payments do not automatically convert the entire property to community property. The correct answer is D. The home is likely Sarah's separate property to the extent of her separate inheritance used for the down payment, provided she can demonstrate the inheritance funds were kept separate and identifiable, and the remaining marital contributions to mortgage payments do not automatically convert the entire property to community property. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for mischaracterization of property acquired during marriage, which has significant implications for its classification as separate or community property under Alabama law. Careful judgment is required to ensure accurate adherence to Alabama's community property principles, particularly concerning the source of funds used for acquisition. The correct approach involves meticulously tracing the source of funds used to purchase the real estate. If the down payment and subsequent mortgage payments were made exclusively with funds inherited by Sarah prior to the marriage, and these funds were kept separate and identifiable, then the property would likely be considered Sarah's separate property. Alabama law generally presumes property acquired during marriage is community property, but this presumption can be rebutted by clear and convincing evidence that the property was acquired with separate funds. The key is demonstrating that the funds used were indeed Sarah's separate property and were not commingled with marital assets. An incorrect approach would be to assume the property is community property simply because it was acquired during the marriage, without investigating the source of the funds. This fails to acknowledge the statutory exceptions for separate property. Another incorrect approach would be to classify the property as community property based on the fact that the mortgage is in both their names, even if the down payment was from Sarah's separate inheritance. While joint mortgage obligations can create marital interests, the initial acquisition and the source of the down payment are critical in determining the property's character. Furthermore, an incorrect approach would be to consider the property community property because the couple lived in it, as the use of the property does not automatically convert separate property into community property if its acquisition was funded by separate assets. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes factual investigation and legal analysis. This involves 1. Identifying the core legal question, property characterization. 2. Gathering all relevant financial documentation, inheritance records, bank statements, purchase agreements. 3. Applying Alabama's statutory definitions and case law regarding separate and community property. And 4. Forming a conclusion based on the evidence and legal principles, rather than making assumptions. Question 12. The assessment process reveals that a married couple in Alabama is undergoing a legal separation. During their marriage, the husband received a significant inheritance from his parents, which he deposited into a joint savings account that also contained funds earned from his salary. The wife is now seeking a division of this savings account as part of the separation proceedings. What is the most appropriate course of action for legal counsel representing either spouse to ensure compliance with Alabama's community property laws? Option A. Recommend that the couple split the entire savings account equally without further investigation, as this is the simplest way to resolve the issue during separation. Option B. Conduct a detailed tracing of the funds in the joint savings account to identify the portion that originated from the husband's inheritance and treat that portion as separate property while dividing the remaining community property funds equitably. Option C. Assume that all funds in the joint savings account are community property and should be divided equally between the spouses, as the account was used for marital expenses. Option D. Advise the wife that since the inheritance was deposited into a joint account, it automatically becomes community property and is therefore subject to equal division. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed tracing of the funds in the joint savings account to identify the portion that originated from the husband's inheritance and treat that portion as separate property while dividing the remaining community property funds equitably. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent complexities of dividing marital assets and liabilities during a legal separation in Alabama, a community property state. The specific challenge lies in accurately identifying and valuing community property versus separate property, especially when commingling has occurred, and ensuring that the division is equitable and compliant with Alabama's specific community property statutes and case law. Careful judgment is required to navigate these nuances and avoid potential legal disputes or unfair outcomes for either spouse. The best professional approach involves a thorough and meticulous inventory and appraisal of all assets and debts acquired during the marriage. This includes distinguishing between property that is presumed to be community property, acquired during the marriage, and separate property, owned before marriage, or acquired during marriage by gift or inheritance. Legal counsel should be engaged to interpret Alabama Code sections pertaining to community property and equitable distribution, ensuring that any agreement or court order accurately reflects the legal status of each asset and liability. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal framework governing marital property in Alabama during separation, prioritizing accurate identification and equitable division as mandated by state law. It ensures that all relevant legal requirements are met, protecting the rights of both parties. An incorrect approach would be to assume that all assets acquired during the marriage are automatically split 50/50 without a detailed examination of their origin and nature. This fails to account for Alabama's recognition of separate property and the legal presumptions that apply. Ethically and legally, this is unacceptable as it could lead to the improper distribution of assets, potentially depriving one spouse of their rightful separate property or failing to achieve an equitable division of community property. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on informal agreements between the spouses without legal documentation or professional advice. While amicable resolutions are desirable, Alabama law requires a formal process for the division of marital property during a legal separation. Informal agreements may not be legally binding or may not adequately address all legal requirements, leading to future disputes and potential invalidation of the division. This approach is professionally deficient because it bypasses the necessary legal safeguards and expert guidance required to ensure a valid and enforceable property division under Alabama law. A further incorrect approach involves prioritizing the emotional desires of one spouse over the legal realities of community property law. While empathy is important, legal professionals must operate within the bounds of the law, focusing solely on what one spouse wants, without a rigorous legal analysis of what they are entitled to under Alabama's community property framework is a failure of professional duty. This can result in an inequitable or legally flawed distribution that is subject to challenge. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, understanding the specific jurisdiction's laws, in this case, Alabama community property law. Second, conducting a comprehensive factual investigation to identify and classify all assets and liabilities. Third, consulting with legal counsel to interpret the law and advise on strategy. Fourth, negotiating or litigating based on a clear understanding of legal rights and obligations. And finally, ensuring all agreements or court orders are properly documented and legally sound. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows that when advising a client on marital property rights in Alabama, which historical perspective most accurately informs the current legal landscape regarding property acquired during marriage? Option A. Applying the full historical framework of Spanish community property law as it was originally implemented in territories that later became part of Alabama. Option B. Recognizing that Alabama's approach to marital property is a hybrid, influenced by common law, but incorporating specific legislative and judicial developments that reflect community property principles. Option C. Believing that Alabama's marital property law has remained static since its territorial days, entirely unaffected by modern legal reforms or influences from other property systems. Option D. Assuming Alabama strictly adheres to the historical English common law doctrine of coverture, where a wife's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's. The correct answer is B. Recognizing that Alabama's approach to marital property is a hybrid, influenced by common law but incorporating specific legislative and judicial developments that reflect community property principles. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the historical evolution of Alabama's community property law is crucial for legal professionals advising clients on marital property rights. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not just knowledge of current statutes, but also an appreciation for how historical influences shape those laws, potentially leading to nuanced interpretations or understanding the rationale behind specific provisions. Careful judgment is required to apply historical context appropriately without misinterpreting its direct applicability to contemporary legal disputes. The best professional approach involves recognizing that Alabama, while not a traditional community property state, has adopted certain community property principles through legislative action and judicial interpretation, particularly concerning the treatment of marital property acquired during the marriage. This approach correctly identifies that Alabama's legal framework is a hybrid, influenced by common law but incorporating community property concepts. The justification lies in adhering to the specific legislative history and judicial precedent within Alabama, which has gradually moved towards recognizing shared marital property rights, even if not under a full community property system. This understanding allows for accurate advice regarding equitable distribution and the rights of spouses. An incorrect approach would be to assume Alabama operates under a pure common law property system, without acknowledging any community property influences. This failure ignores legislative enactments and judicial decisions that have introduced community property-like concepts, leading to potentially inaccurate advice on property division and spousal rights. Another incorrect approach is to mistakenly apply the full suite of community property laws from a traditional community property state, like Texas or California, to Alabama. This is a significant regulatory failure as it disregards Alabama's unique statutory framework and judicial interpretations, leading to incorrect legal conclusions and potentially detrimental outcomes for clients. Finally, an approach that solely focuses on the historical origins of common law property, without considering subsequent legislative modifications that introduced community property principles, would also be flawed, as it fails to account for the dynamic nature of Alabama's marital property law. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the governing jurisdiction, Alabama. They must then research the specific statutory framework and relevant case law pertaining to marital property within that jurisdiction. This includes understanding the historical trajectory of these laws, noting any legislative shifts towards or away from community property principles. When advising clients, professionals should clearly articulate the specific legal status of marital property in Alabama, distinguishing it from pure common law or pure community property systems, and grounding their advice in the established legal precedent and statutory provisions of the state. Question 14. The evaluation methodology shows that a financial advisor in Alabama is assisting a client whose spouse recently received a significant inheritance from a distant relative. The inheritance was deposited into a separate bank account solely in the recipient spouse's name. The client is now asking if these inherited funds are considered marital property and can be freely used for joint household expenses and investments. What is the most appropriate professional guidance to provide regarding the characterization of this inheritance under Alabama law? Option A. Advise the client that the inheritance is presumed to be the separate property of the recipient spouse under Alabama law, and its character as separate property will be maintained as long as it is not commingled with marital assets, or there is no clear intent to gift it to the marital estate. Option B. Inform the client that any asset received during the marriage is automatically considered marital property in Alabama, regardless of its source, and can be used for joint expenses. Option C. Recommend that the inherited funds be immediately transferred to a joint account to signify the intent to make it marital property for the benefit of the household. Option D. Explain that since the inheritance was received during the marriage, it is now community property and subject to equal division between the spouses. The correct answer is A. Advise the client that the inheritance is presumed to be the separate property of the recipient spouse under Alabama law, and its character as separate property will be maintained as long as it is not commingled with marital assets, or there is no clear intent to gift it to the marital estate. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the nuances of community property law in Alabama, particularly concerning gifts and inheritances, is crucial for financial professionals. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires distinguishing between separate and community property when dealing with assets received during a marriage, which can have significant implications for ownership, management, and distribution upon divorce or death. Alabama, while not a traditional community property state, has specific statutory provisions that create a form of community property for certain assets, making it imperative to correctly identify the character of gifted or inherited property. The correct approach involves meticulously tracing the source of the funds and the intent of the donor or testator. In Alabama, property acquired by gift or inheritance during the marriage is generally considered the separate property of the recipient spouse, unless there is clear evidence of intent to make a gift to both spouses or to the marital estate. Therefore, when a spouse receives a substantial inheritance, the professional must confirm that the funds were deposited into an account solely in the recipient spouse's name and were not commingled with marital funds. This ensures compliance with Alabama law, which presumes inherited property to be separate unless proven otherwise. Proper documentation, such as bank statements and inheritance documents, is vital to support this classification. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any asset received during the marriage automatically becomes part of the marital estate, regardless of its source. This fails to recognize Alabama's statutory framework that designates gifts and inheritances as separate property. Another incorrect approach is to treat gifted or inherited funds as community property simply because they were received during the marriage and deposited into a joint account, without further investigation into the donor's intent or the recipient spouse's actions to maintain its separate character. This overlooks the legal presumption of separate property for inheritances and gifts in Alabama, and the potential for commingling to alter property characterization. A further incorrect approach is to advise the recipient spouse to freely spend the inherited funds on joint marital expenses without considering the potential legal ramifications for property division, as this could inadvertently convert separate property into marital property or create disputes regarding reimbursement. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accurate legal classification of assets. This involves 1. Identifying the source of the asset, gift, inheritance, earnings, etc. 2. Determining the timing of acquisition relative to the marriage. 3. Consulting relevant state statutes, in this case, Alabama law regarding separate and marital property. 4. Examining documentation to confirm the nature of the acquisition and any intent of the donor/testator. And 5. Advising clients on the implications of commingling or other actions that could alter the property's character. Question 15. The evaluation methodology shows that a real estate agent in Alabama is facilitating the sale of a property. One spouse is eager to sell and has signed the listing agreement and is prepared to sign the deed. However, the other spouse has expressed reluctance and has not signed any documents related to the sale. The agent is aware that the property has been the couple's primary residence for several years. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agent to ensure compliance with Alabama law? Option A. Proceed with the sale using only the signature of the spouse who signed the listing agreement, assuming their consent is sufficient. Option B. Advise the selling spouse that spousal consent is not required as long as the property is not solely titled in their name. Option C. Obtain the signature of both spouses on the deed of conveyance before finalizing the sale, especially if the property is their homestead. Option D. Obtain a written affidavit from the selling spouse, stating that the non-selling spouse has no legal claim or interest in the property. The correct answer is C. Obtain the signature of both spouses on the deed of conveyance before finalizing the sale, especially if the property is their homestead. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a transaction that could potentially impact the marital property rights of a spouse who is not directly involved in the negotiation or signing of the agreement. Alabama law, while not a full community property state, has provisions that can protect spousal interests in certain property, particularly homestead property. Navigating these protections requires careful attention to the specific nature of the property and the transaction, demanding a judgment that balances the parties' immediate contractual desires with long-term legal compliance and ethical obligations to all involved parties. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves verifying the nature of the property being conveyed. If the property is the homestead of the parties, Alabama law requires the consent of both spouses to alienate or mortgage it. Therefore, obtaining the signature of the non-selling spouse on the deed of conveyance is legally mandated and ethically imperative to ensure the validity of the transaction and protect the non-selling spouse's rights. This approach directly addresses the legal requirements of Alabama law concerning homestead property and ensures that the transaction is fully compliant and enforceable. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the sale based solely on the signature of the spouse who initiated the transaction, without confirming the homestead status and obtaining the other spouse's consent if applicable, constitutes a significant regulatory failure. This approach disregards Alabama's statutory protections for homestead property, potentially rendering the deed voidable and exposing the parties and the professional to legal liability. Accepting a written statement from the selling spouse, asserting that the other spouse has no interest in the property, without independent verification or obtaining the other spouse's signature, is also professionally unacceptable. It relies on an unsubstantiated claim and bypasses the legal requirement for spousal consent on homestead property, creating a risk of future disputes and legal challenges. Assuming that because the property is not titled solely in the name of the selling spouse, spousal consent is not required, is a flawed assumption. Alabama law's homestead protections are not solely dependent on title, but on the use of the property as a primary residence. This approach fails to consider the broader legal implications of spousal rights in homestead property. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the nature of the property involved in any transaction, particularly its homestead status. 2. Consulting relevant Alabama statutes and case law regarding spousal rights and property transactions. 3. Verifying the marital status of the parties and the property's use as a homestead. 4. Ensuring all legally required spousal consents are obtained before finalizing any transaction affecting homestead property. 5. Documenting all due diligence and compliance efforts. Question 16. Governance review demonstrates that in Alabama, a spouse is considering entering into a significant personal investment that would involve liquidating a substantial portion of jointly held marital assets. What is the most appropriate course of action for this spouse to uphold their fiduciary duties to their partner concerning these marital assets? Option A. Immediately and fully disclose the proposed investment to their spouse, including all material details, risks, and potential impacts on the marital estate, and seek their informed consent. Option B. Proceed with the investment, assuming their spouse would approve if they knew, and inform them after the transaction is complete. Option C. Undertake the investment solely for their personal financial growth, as individual financial decisions are separate from marital property management. Option D. Disclose the investment to their spouse, but only provide a general overview, omitting specific details about the risks involved. The correct answer is A. Immediately and fully disclose the proposed investment to their spouse, including all material details, risks, and potential impacts on the marital estate, and seek their informed consent. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a spouse who is presumed to be acting in the best interest of the marital estate, potentially engaging in self-dealing or actions that could disadvantage the other spouse's community property rights. Alabama law, while recognizing community property principles in certain contexts, though it is not a pure community property state, its divorce law distributes marital property equitably, and prenuptial agreements can establish separate property, imposes fiduciary duties on spouses when managing or disposing of marital assets. These duties require honesty, full disclosure, and acting with the utmost good faith towards each other concerning their shared financial interests. The core of the challenge lies in balancing individual autonomy with the legal and ethical obligations owed to one's spouse regarding marital property. The best professional approach involves the spouse who is aware of the potential conflict to immediately and fully disclose the proposed transaction to their spouse. This disclosure must include all material facts about the transaction, including its nature, purpose, potential risks and benefits, and how it might impact the marital estate. This approach aligns with the fiduciary duty of full disclosure and good faith, ensuring the other spouse has the necessary information to consent or object, thereby protecting their equitable interest in the marital property. Alabama law, particularly in the context of divorce and property division, emphasizes fairness and transparency in dealings involving marital assets. An approach where the spouse proceeds with the transaction without informing their spouse is ethically and legally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a breach of the fiduciary duty of disclosure and good faith. It deprives the other spouse of the opportunity to protect their interests and could lead to legal challenges and remedies, including equitable adjustments in property division or damages. Another unacceptable approach is to provide only partial or misleading information about the transaction. This also violates the duty of full disclosure and good faith. The law requires complete and accurate information, not just a superficial acknowledgement of a transaction. Misleading a spouse about the nature or impact of a transaction undermines the trust inherent in the marital relationship and the legal framework governing marital property. Finally, an approach where the spouse attempts to justify the transaction by claiming it was for their personal benefit without considering the impact on the marital estate is also flawed. While spouses have individual rights, the management of marital property is subject to fiduciary obligations. Actions that unilaterally benefit one spouse at the potential detriment of the other, without proper disclosure and consent, are inconsistent with these duties. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing transparency and open communication. The decision-making process should involve 1. identifying the existence of a potential conflict of interest or transaction affecting marital property. 2. Recognizing the fiduciary duties owed to the spouse. 3. Committing to full and honest disclosure of all material facts. 4. Seeking informed consent from the spouse. 5. If consent cannot be obtained or if there is significant risk, seeking independent legal counsel to understand the implications and navigate the situation appropriately. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows a situation in Alabama where a divorcing couple has accumulated various assets and debts throughout their marriage. The couple is seeking to divide their community property. Which of the following approaches best reflects the legal requirements for dividing community property in Alabama? Option A. Focus solely on assets that are easily liquidated and ignore more complex or illiquid assets in the division process. Option B. Conduct a thorough inventory and professional valuation of all assets and debts acquired during the marriage, then propose a division that equitably considers the statutory factors for distribution under Alabama law. Option C. Prioritize the immediate satisfaction of one spouse's stated desires for specific assets, even if it results in a disproportionate division of the overall marital estate. Option D. Assume a strict 50/50 division of all assets and debts without further analysis, as this is the standard for community property states. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough inventory and professional valuation of all assets and debts acquired during the marriage, then propose a division that equitably considers the statutory factors for distribution under Alabama law. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent subjectivity in valuing certain assets and the potential for emotional entanglement during divorce proceedings in Alabama. A thorough understanding of Alabama's community property laws is paramount to ensure a fair and equitable division. The correct approach involves a comprehensive inventory and valuation of all assets and debts acquired during the marriage, followed by an equitable distribution that considers the statutory factors outlined in Alabama law. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the Alabama Code's framework for community property division, which mandates an equitable, though not necessarily equal, distribution. Alabama Code Section 30-2-51 provides the court with broad discretion to divide marital property in a manner that is fair and just, taking into account factors such as the length of the marriage, the financial contributions of each spouse, and the economic circumstances of each party. This methodical and legally grounded process minimizes disputes and ensures compliance with state statutes. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the emotional desires of one spouse over the legal requirements for equitable distribution. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama law requires a judicial determination of fairness, not simply the fulfillment of personal preferences. Another incorrect approach is to assume an automatic 50/50 split of all assets without considering the statutory factors. While an equal division is often equitable, it is not mandated, and failing to consider factors like contributions or economic circumstances can lead to an inequitable outcome and a violation of the spirit and letter of Alabama's community property statutes. Finally, an approach that neglects to properly value or even identify all community assets and debts before proposing a division is fundamentally flawed. This oversight can result in significant financial disparities and legal challenges, as it bypasses the essential first step of establishing the marital estate to be divided. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the Alabama Code governing marital property division. This involves meticulous asset and debt identification and valuation, followed by a reasoned proposal for distribution that explicitly addresses the statutory factors. Open communication with clients about the legal framework and realistic expectations is crucial, alongside a commitment to achieving an outcome that is both legally compliant and demonstrably equitable. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that when advising a married couple in Alabama regarding the classification of a valuable antique purchased during their marriage, which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama community property law presumptions? Option A. Presuming the antique is community property and requiring the spouse claiming it as separate property to provide clear and convincing evidence of its separate origin. Option B. Presuming the antique is separate property because it was purchased during the marriage and the title could potentially be placed in one spouse's name. Option C. Assuming that any asset acquired during the marriage is separate property unless proven otherwise by the non-acquiring spouse. Option D. Relying solely on the testimony of the spouse who claims the antique was a personal gift to them, without requiring documentation of the gift. Correct answer is A. Presuming the antique is community property and requiring the spouse claiming it as separate property to provide clear and convincing evidence of its separate origin. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding presumptions in Alabama community property law is crucial for legal professionals advising clients on marital assets. This scenario is professionally challenging because the presumption of community property is rebuttable, and the burden of proof rests on the party claiming separate property. Misinterpreting or misapplying these presumptions can lead to significant financial disputes and legal errors. Careful judgment is required to correctly identify the nature of property acquired during the marriage. The best professional approach involves meticulously examining the source of funds and the intent of the parties at the time of acquisition. When property is acquired during the marriage, Alabama law presumes it to be community property. To overcome this presumption, the spouse claiming the property as separate must present clear and convincing evidence that it was acquired with their separate funds or was a gift or inheritance specifically for them. This requires detailed record keeping and a thorough understanding of the statutory definitions of separate and community property in Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any property titled solely in one spouse's name is automatically separate property. Alabama law does not automatically equate sole title with separate ownership. The presumption of community property can still apply. This failure to adhere to the statutory presumption is a significant regulatory and ethical lapse. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the testimony of the spouse claiming separate property without corroborating evidence. While testimony is a component, the legal standard requires clear and convincing evidence, which often necessitates documentation such as bank statements, gift letters, or inheritance records to demonstrate the separate origin of the funds used for acquisition. A further incorrect approach is to apply the presumption of separate property to assets acquired during the marriage. This directly contradicts Alabama's statutory framework, which establishes a strong presumption in favor of community property for assets acquired during the marital union. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves, first, identifying the date of acquisition of the property in question and whether it falls within the period of the marriage. Second, applying the Alabama statutory presumption that property acquired during marriage is community property. Third, determining which party bears the burden of proof to rebut this presumption. Fourth, evaluating the quality and sufficiency of the evidence presented to overcome the presumption, adhering to the clear and convincing standard. Finally, applying the relevant Alabama case law and statutes to reach a legally sound conclusion regarding the property's classification. Question 19. The control framework reveals that in Alabama, when a court is tasked with determining the amount and duration of spousal support, what is the most appropriate methodology for ensuring a fair and legally compliant outcome? Option A. A determination based on the emotional needs and perceived fault of one of the parties, irrespective of the statutory factors. Option B. An exclusive focus on the current income of each party, disregarding their potential to earn income in the future. Option C. A comprehensive evaluation of all statutory factors enumerated in Alabama Code Section 30-2-57, including income, earning capacity, needs, and the duration of the marriage. Option D. A primary emphasis on the length of the marriage, with other factors playing a secondary role in the decision-making process. The correct answer is C. A comprehensive evaluation of all statutory factors enumerated in Alabama Code Section 30-2-57, including income, earning capacity, needs, and the duration of the marriage. Explanation. The control framework reveals that determining spousal support in Alabama involves a nuanced consideration of various statutory factors, making each case professionally challenging due to the inherent subjectivity and the potential for significant financial impact on the parties. Careful judgment is required to balance these factors equitably. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive evaluation of all statutory factors outlined in Alabama Code Section 30-2-57. This includes a thorough assessment of each party's income, earning capacity, needs, and the duration of the marriage, among other considerations. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legislative mandate, ensuring that the court's decision is grounded in established legal principles designed to achieve fairness and equity. By systematically reviewing each factor, legal professionals can advocate effectively, and judges can make informed decisions that are legally defensible and ethically sound, promoting the well-being of both spouses. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the current income of each party without considering their respective earning capacities. This fails to comply with Alabama law, which explicitly mandates consideration of earning capacity. Such a narrow focus could lead to an inequitable outcome, potentially penalizing a spouse who has foregone career advancement for the benefit of the marriage or is capable of earning more but is currently underemployed. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the length of the marriage above all other factors when determining the amount and duration of spousal support. While the duration of the marriage is a significant factor, Alabama law requires a holistic review of all enumerated factors. Overemphasizing the marriage length without adequately considering the financial circumstances, needs, and contributions of each party would violate the spirit and letter of the law, potentially resulting in an unjust award. A further incorrect approach would be to base the spousal support decision primarily on the emotional needs or perceived fault of one of the parties, without a direct link to the statutory factors. Alabama law does not permit spousal support awards to be punitive or based on marital misconduct, unless it directly impacts the financial circumstances of the parties in a way that is contemplated by the statutory factors. This approach deviates from the objective legal framework and introduces personal bias, undermining the integrity of the judicial process. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a meticulous review of Alabama Code Section 30-2-57. This involves gathering all relevant financial documentation, understanding each party's vocational abilities and limitations, and carefully documenting how each statutory factor applies to the specific facts of the case. This systematic and legally compliant method ensures that all relevant considerations are addressed, leading to a well-reasoned and defensible spousal support determination. Question 20. Implementation of Alabama's community property law requires careful consideration of asset valuation in divorce proceedings. A married couple in Alabama has accumulated various assets and debts. The husband started a sole proprietorship business 2 years before the marriage, which had a fair market value of $150,000 at the time of marriage. During the 15-year marriage, the business grew significantly due to the joint efforts of both spouses, and its fair market value at the time of divorce is $750,000. The wife also inherited $50,000 from her parents 5 years into the marriage, which she deposited into a separate savings account and has not commingled with marital funds. Additionally, they jointly purchased a home for $300,000 10 years ago, with a current outstanding mortgage balance of $100,000 and a current fair market value of $500,000. They also incurred $20,000 in credit card debt during the marriage. Assuming Alabama Code Section 30-4-3 governs, what is the total value of the community property subject to equitable division, and how should the appreciation of the business be calculated for this purpose? Option A. The community property subject to division is $620,000. The appreciation of the business is calculated as the current fair market value minus the fair market value at the time of marriage. $750,000 $150,000 equals $600,000. The inherited funds are separate property. Option B. The community property subject to division is $1,000,000. The appreciation of the business is calculated as the current fair market value, $750,000. The inherited funds are community property. Option C. The community property subject to division is $770,000. The appreciation of the business is calculated as the current fair market value minus the fair market value at the time of marriage. $150,000 equals $600,000. The inherited funds are community property. Option D. The community property subject to division is $620,000. The appreciation of the business is calculated as the current fair market value minus the fair market value at the time of marriage. $750,000 $150, 000 equals $600, 000. The inherited funds are community property. The correct answer is A. The community property subject to division is $620, 000. The appreciation of the business is calculated as the current fair market value minus the fair market value at the time of marriage. $750, 000 $150, 000 equals $600, 000. The inherited funds are separate property. Explanation. Implementation of Alabama's community property laws in divorce proceedings presents a significant professional challenge due to the precise nature of asset valuation and the equitable distribution principles mandated by state law. A thorough understanding of the marital estate, including separate and community property, is paramount. The professional's duty is to ensure a division that is both legally compliant and fair, avoiding any mischaracterization of property or the application of inappropriate valuation methods. The correct approach involves a meticulous inventory and valuation of all assets and debts acquired during the marriage, classifying them as either separate or community property according to Alabama Code Section 30-4-3. Community property is subject to equitable division, which does not necessarily mean a 50/50 split, but rather a division that is fair and just under the circumstances. This includes considering factors such as the length of the marriage, the contributions of each spouse, and the economic circumstances of each party. The valuation of a business interest, for instance, would require employing recognized accounting principles and potentially engaging a forensic accountant to determine its fair market value at the time of divorce. For example, if a closely held business was started by one spouse before the marriage, but significantly grew in value during the marriage due to the efforts of both spouses, the appreciation in value during the marriage would likely be considered community property. Valuation would then focus on determining this marital appreciation. An incorrect approach would be to simply divide all assets equally without first properly classifying them. This fails to acknowledge the distinction between separate property, which is not subject to division, and community property. For example, if one spouse inherited a sum of money during the marriage and kept it in a separate account, it remains their separate property and should not be included in the community estate for division. Another incorrect approach would be to use a valuation method that is not generally accepted in accounting or business valuation, leading to an inaccurate assessment of the marital estate's value. For instance, using a book value for a business that does not reflect its true market potential or goodwill would result in an inequitable distribution. Furthermore, ignoring debts incurred during the marriage and failing to assign responsibility for them would also lead to an improper division. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive understanding of Alabama's community property statutes and relevant case law. This involves diligent fact-finding, accurate asset and debt identification, and appropriate valuation methodologies. Professionals must prioritize legal compliance and ethical conduct, ensuring that all parties are treated fairly and that the division of property reflects the realities of the marital estate and the legal framework.